I want to turn on the television, read newspapers, although Mr. Sarbar and I are on a health kick, trying not to listen, this is true, to spend actually less time listening in on the news, making sure that we solder shut CNN and other news sources. It's difficult stuff to listen to, and you know, so many of the democratic institutions, you take NATO and the recent conversations about NATO, and you look at international institutions, it occurs to me that the G7 is too tiny, but you were the architect. I don't know how many people remember that you were the architect and the first chair of the G20. Is there any pride or relevance in terms of your feeling about these kind of global settings where you can have adult conversations about a better future?
Well, the G20, where it started, I was a G7 finance minister, and so we would meet and we would talk. And I don't expect that you would remember this, but the 3 months before I brought down the budget that eventually dealt with the deficit, Mexico, there was a Mexican crisis, and what happens, Canada had a terrible balance sheet, just an awful balance sheet at that time. And what happens is, when one country gets into trouble, the markets attack all of the countries that have got weak balance sheets. So all of a sudden, I'm over to bring down this budget which was the one that eventually led to the elimination of the deficit. But nobody knew that this was what was going to happen. And Mexico got into a little bit of trouble, and our interest rates started to decline. And interest rates were very high at that point. Economies were good, but interest rates were very high. If they had continued going on any higher, we were Greece. And so I went to the G7 and I simply said, listen, this is crazy. A country like Mexico gets in trouble. We, the G7, can't do anything about it. And it makes no sense to China and India and some of these other countries. What the heck are we doing talking about? Here I am, the Chinese economy is growing, India is going to be growing. Nobody would listen to the idea of doing anything. Everybody thought it was such a wonderful thing to be in some organization with the United States. The other 6, they wouldn't, or they're 5, and they wouldn't know anything about it. However, 2 years later, the financial crisis called the Asian crisis. This is when Russia defaulted on their debt, Brazil devalued, Korea got into big trouble and everything else. The Asian crisis hit. And so the G7, we all simply sat down at the G7 finance ministers and essentially said, this is what Korea must do, this is what Indonesia must do, this is what these countries must do. And they told us to go to hell. They said, hey, who are you guys telling us what to do with our economies? We're not at the table. So on the way out of that G7 meeting, Larry Summers, who was at that time the U.S. Treasurer, I got him aside and I said, listen, remember that conversation I had with you? Well, I think the time has come. He agreed, and we walked out of the meeting. The meeting was in Washington. Went into his office, took a blank sheet of paper, and sat down and started looking at the countries. Now you think about this. We sat down and then we started saying we are going to get the regional powers like Indonesia, South Africa, this kind of thing, along with China and India. You never could have done it if you established a commission. You never could have agreed on what those countries had to be. It had to be just totally arbitrary. And so between the two of us, we agreed on the countries. And I got to tell you, it felt very good being a Canadian, but it's not bad to have the American Secretary Treasurer on your side. And then we went back. We agreed that I would go out and speak to the other G7 members, and they all agreed. And that's how the G20. That's actually how the G20 came into being at the finance minister's level. Then I started to push to get it at the leaders level, and got nowhere at all. After a period of time, when I became prime minister, I said I was going to raise it to the leaders level, But by this time, the G20 had become the finance ministers meeting, and the other ministers did too. The G7 started to fade. I got everybody outside except George Bush. George Bush didn't say yes, he wouldn't say no, he just wouldn't say. And we were going to, I basically said, we're going to do a G20 meeting with the Chinese and Canada jointly. We'll call a meeting at the leaders level and we'll invite everybody. Everybody said they'd come, and at that point the Americans would come. What happened, however, was the election occurred. And so I suddenly found myself in a somewhat awkward position of not being able to invite anybody to anything. And so...
you got in the back of the car and nothing happened.
We know what happened, nothing happened, but we knew darn well at the first sign of a crisis, they heard the G20 would go to the leaders level, and that's exactly what happened.
And a pretty important vehicle, at least a vehicle I know.
It's, in my opinion, it's in... you talked about what's happened with NATO. We're seeing what's happened, okay? The United States is turning in on itself. The United Kingdom is turning in on itself. The European Union is striving mightily to keep its act together. The problem that is happening is, but the other big thing that's happening is that all of the support for the major multilateral institutions is beginning to wane. The United Nations, the WTO, all of these organizations, the High Commissioner for Refugees, are not getting the support that they have. And the only body that's going to be able to make that happen is going to be the G20. So what you've got is you've got a rising China, and you've got a rising China and a United States which is actually pulling out of the battle. I think there's a phenomenal opportunity for the G20 to act within this case, and I think there's a phenomenal opportunity for Canada to act within this body. I think that because of what is happening, the G20 is the only body that is going to be able to deal with these things. Don't forget, you're going to say, well, what about like Russia's? The G7 is 7 compatible economies. Nobody in the G20 has to like each other, and most of them don't. But the fact is that the one thing that you got to recognize is that there is a global interest that is, if it's served, your national interest will be served. So my own view is that there's a huge opportunity for Canada within the G20, and the one recommendation that I would make to anybody here, Chrystia Freeland made a speech 2 days ago in the House of Commons. And I can tell you, anybody who wants to understand what has to happen, I think it's one of the most, I don't know, Lyle, you might have the same view or not, but I think it is one of the most significant speeches that has been given in the House of Commons for a long, long time.